everybody needs an advocate.
Because I'm not there 24/7.
Families that have hemophilia mature faster.
I've been feeling a lot of anxiety lately.
I'm so tired of being strong.
To understand how far we've come helps you appreciate where we are now.
No is just no for this person. Somebody's gonna say yes sooner or later.
And it helps you understand that there are more steps to be taken in the future.
You're the first person I've met with a bleeding disorder.
Let's fight the disease and not the people who have it.
Please make welcome Julian Borjas. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. We joked about how we needed the Price is Right theme music for everyone as they entered. Hi, Julian.
How are you?
I'm good. So Julian is here from Chicago, Illinois, where you work as a Hope Group leader. You've got some hometown love out there. And you work as a Hope Group leader, which is awesome. And you have severe hemophilia A. And so for those of the people that are listening or are listeners of the podcast that might not know, can you describe how Hope Groups work?
It's kind of peer-to-peer. People with hemophilia, families affected, coming together to kind of talk to each other one-on-one, share their experiences, get tips and tricks, basically anything that is hemophilia related in your life.
And when did you first start working as a Hope Group leader?
2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, cool. What does your role as leader exactly entail? Since it is more of a one-to-one, connecting people to each other, what does it mean to be a leader of a group like that?
It seems weird to say leader because I'm not the fearless leader.
Yeah.
I'm just provide the space for families and people affected to come together and discuss.
But it is, I was just, thinking about Jonathan's comments yesterday, that is what it means to be a leader, is to just be that first person, maybe that just says, okay, I was here first, so I turned the lights on, so I guess I'm the leader. I unlocked the door, and now you're giving an opportunity to other people to connect.
Yeah, no, we do Facebook. And so I've had many events where it's been like 2 or 3 people that have RSVP'd, so you're sitting there and you're like, no one's gonna show up, and then all of a sudden the room is full.
I was really struck by the fact that, obviously now you're very involved in the community, you're very dedicated to the community, but that hasn't always been the case. And in some ways, you described yourself as sort of the target for what Hope does. Yeah. Can you speak to that a little and tell us about your history and your relationship with your bleeding disorder?
Yeah, so I lived most of my childhood and going into my adult life not really acknowledging hemophilia. I didn't want to be seen as a hemophiliac. I wanted to be my own person. It wasn't my primary identity. And then as I got older, I wanted to be a part of a community, and that is what kind of led me into the open arms of Hope and talking to people and families, and then realizing that this part of me that I hadn't been acknowledging actually really needed to find a home. And this is where I found it.
And what were those, you sort of talked about connecting with Jonathan. Can you share about that experience and what made that different coming into your life at that moment that you were like, I am ready to embrace this?
Jonathan is a pretty busy guy. His phone is always going off. But the fact that he found the time to just kind of acknowledge me and tell me about the history of hemophilia, where the current state is, and how I could help, that was on its own enough. Someone who's a CEO of a big charity would take the time to kind of welcome me in.
And did Hope seem different to you than other organizations that you were aware of as a person with a bleeding disorder?
Yeah, it seemed like, as a person with a bleeding disorder, we were very front and center. It's kind of put into your, you catch the ball and you run with it. And so I really felt like, I was in charge and that people that were with me were going to be empowered as well.
And when you started engaging, as a person who hadn't done that through most of your life at that point, what was the difference that you started noticing in your overall quality of life?
I think just the openness, for hemophilia, it's an internal disease, so you don't have to openly acknowledge it all the time. And having the courage to tell people that, this is what I'm living with, and this is, one of the many problems that I'm dealing with, or, this is also a boon, that's something that I enjoy, that space to talk and just kind of be myself.
I think we hear that a lot of like, as much as this is a challenge, it's also a gift in unexpected ways. And sometimes it takes a while to get there, to realize that it is that way. And often I think it comes with community and realizing the family that you have, the community that you have. But before you're able to sort of make that shift, it ends up feeling like a burden, So it sounds like when you connected, you were able to sort of switch that mentality. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, the statement, like the more hands, the lighter the load, is very true. And it's definitely something, especially, like it's with hemophilia, it's you're 1 in 1,000. It's not very common. And so it's kind of almost like depression, where you tell yourself, I'm the only one. And then when you hear people that are part of that community that have those experiences that are very similar to yourself, you're like, I'm not the only one, and that kind of is uplifting on its own.
You shared on the phone with me something that I'd love to have the room hear about, which is that, you were diagnosed at birth, you've had access to care, for your whole life, even before you became as actively involved as you are now, but that hasn't always been the case for your whole family. Do you mind talking about your 2 uncles and your aunt who had different experiences with their bleeding disorders?
So I had 2 uncles. One died when he was very young. He went to an all-white hospital, and he was African American, and they actually gave him Advil, so he bled more and ended up bleeding out, and so he passed away. And then I had another uncle that I don't really remember outside of him sitting on a bed, and I think that was his life due to joint damage or whatever was going on. That's all I remember of him. And then my aunt, who was a wonderful person, she was an addiction counselist for our community. We're just talking about opioid and pain, but for their community, that's the only alternative they have is use of pain medications. So
with sickle cell.
She had sickle cell anemia.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So she was in the hospital last year. It was a struggle always to advocate for her. And when she passed away, that was still very forefront, that she was part of a community that didn't have the kind of support structures that hemophilia had.
Were you able to relate to that experience, or did you always just feel like, wow, hemophilia exists and, it exists in a different category from, for example, sickle cell? Did you feel that difference in your lifetime?
I mean, yeah, you understand that there is a difference in hemophilia from other disease states. So for instance, we have a large community. We have people that you can talk to. We have medication that will help you and give you a kind of normalized life. So that's wonderful. But that is not what everyone else experiences. And so you're kind of, have her on both sides of the fence and realizing that, on one hand, I feel like I have a lot to deal with. But then you can very clearly see that, the grass isn't always greener, and you can kind of realize that, other people have a hard time as well.
You mentioned about seeing a leader from within the sickle cell community speak not too long ago and talk about the idea of support groups and as having sort of an outside-the-box definition of what could constitute a support group and members of an individual's support group. Can you share that with our audience a little bit?
I loved it. It was a woman that was head of a sickle cell board, and she said, you got to create your own power team. And she said, I keep my doctor in my power team because they keep me healthy. I keep my hairstylist in my power team because she keeps me right and tight. She has a prayer group, and she just basically said, and I think this is just good advice, keep people in your life that support you. Your own cheerleader squad that when you're feeling down has got your back. And so that was what she said was useful when dealing with sickle cell. And that is kind of what I realized that hope groups had become for me. It's your cheer squad, the people that are there for you when you're down.
Beautiful. In my case, it would include my cat.
Mine
I feel
too.
like I need to mention that. You too?
Yes.
I love that a lot. All right, thank you so much, Julian. We will
Thank you.
talk more, but for now, I would like to invite up our next guest. Please make welcome Debbie De La Riva. What? What?
That is so cool.
Wow. Can we hear it for our sound team, please? That just... All my dreams just came true. Speaking of dreams, in the theme of dreams, yes, dream stated, dream accomplished. It's that easy. If you say it out loud into a microphone, it happens. Welcome, Debbie.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you for joining us on stage. Thank you for bringing your koala.
Absolutely.
Yes.
We're inseparable.
Is your koala part of your support team?
He's just part of my vision.
I love
That's
it.
the deal.
I love that so much. So, a little bit about Debbie. Some of you might know her already or may have attended her session yesterday. Very involved with the community for many years. She ran the Lone Star chapter, and she's also been a guest on 2 of our other podcasts, the Bloodstream podcast and Ask the Expert with Chris Bombardier. And you have mild hemophilia, and you are a hemo mom of 2.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, obviously, with yesterday and everything, you're here to facilitate programs around mental illness, depression, and suicide prevention. And in some ways, those subjects and that work has been in your life even longer than bleeding disorders, which might come as a surprise to some people. Can you talk about your background in those areas?
I think it's kind of an interesting story, but then most people think their stories are interesting anyway. But, I started out in college wanting to be a pediatrician. That was it. I just knew it since I was 12. So I was in pre-med. And then I got to things like organic chemistry, and I said, this is not it. Not it at all.
Wait a minute. No, thank you.
So I went to study in psychology and got a master's degree and then became licensed as a professional counselor. And one of the neatest things I got to do is work in a psychiatric hospital in the very, very beginning. And really what became apparent to me is that the difference between the people in and the people on the other side is health insurance. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Because people there were acting normal given what they experienced.
Yeah.
And they were smart enough and crafty enough to get the help.
Wow, that's very powerful. Because I think a lot of people do sort of think of it as other or, sort of in its own category. If you're,
right.
That extreme, it's like, no, that belongs over there. But I think that's a really good point to make. So you worked in a psychiatric hospital.
Right.
And that was also in the Houston area?
Yes,
Okay.
all the time.
And then you have done some other work as well. You were telling me, and maybe I'm jumping ahead in your timeline a little bit, but you were talking about on the phone working with Mental Health America and starting to create that catalog of pro bono therapists.
Right, I guess I should go back a little bit. So after the psychiatric hospital experience, that's the experience of my kids. Mm-hmm. And so I have a beautiful daughter who's 25. She's not affected, but she is affected. She's not a carrier with the bleeding disorder.
Good clarification. Yeah.
And then my son, of course, who was born in November 30th, which actually happens to be Patrick Lynch's birthday. I just found out. That's kind of cool.
Nice.
So, and that's when I decided to stay home and raise my kids.
Okay, yeah. And that's also because Jorge, your son, was diagnosed at birth as severe hemophilia. And that's when you also learned your factor levels.
That's right. I found out that I have mild hemophilia, 38%.
And, yeah, what was that moment like for you to sort of suddenly have a name like that attached to your identity?
I don't think my story is atypical. Having mild hemophilia, I didn't have a lot of experiences of bleeding, but then when you get a label to it and you look back, that isn't normal to have a menstrual period last for 45 days, or to have a tooth extraction and have the tea bag in your mouth for days because you can't stop bleeding.
Yeah.
The bleeding episode I had that was most impactful was before my son was born too. I had a baby that didn't develop and therefore I had to have a DNC. And 24 hours after the procedure, I just could not stop bleeding.
Wow.
And was treated for that too.
Yeah. So did learning that you had mild hemophilia come as sort of a relief because you were finally able to understand what was going on in your body?
Well, again, it wasn't that impactful for me. It's kind of strange. All those things can happen, but I didn't focus on myself. And so the label itself didn't really make a lot of sense to me, nor have that aha moment.
Okay. Because you were just focused on your kids mainly at that point.
Pretty much.
Yeah. I think a lot of people can relate to that. And so that's when you got involved with your local chapter and your family became very involved.
Exactly. So really when my son was in high school, that's when I began to look at, okay, they're about to leave. What is in life for me?
Yeah.
And then that's when I became super involved with the chapter. I went to my first meeting, and at the first meeting, like most of us, if we have a pulse or an interest, you get to be on the board of directors, in your local chapter. And so, and then I just caught the bug.
Yeah.
And then I became the executive director, and best 12 years of my life when I was the director.
That's beautiful. So one way of looking at it is you had, motherhood aside, you sort of had these two areas of experience and excellence and training. One being in mental health and social work, which was sort of your life before kids. And then in your life after kids was leadership within the bleeding disorders community.
Exactly.
And then you shared with me on the phone that there was a moment earlier this year where those two worlds converged.
It's really something. When you really think about it, my life was designed to be at this point in time right now, because of the interest in psychology and the knowing that we're in a community where stress is the norm, be it financial stress, stress coming out of bleeds, stress coming out of knowing that maybe you've had history of hemophilia in your family, and then all of a sudden you have a newborn, and you have all those images and thoughts about what that was like for that other member, and now you're trying to figure out your road with hemophilia.
Yeah.
So, but again, it didn't blend. Those two worlds stayed apart until really February 17th of this year, and that's when I experienced a major giant in our community. I experienced the fact that he died by suicide, and that's Barry Hardy. Barry Hardy was an exceptional and is an exceptional person. He will never be known or remembered by the way he died. He'll always be remembered by the way he lived his life and used his moments on earth. And I want to do a disclaimer here to say that, I talk a lot about Barry's death, but I want to acknowledge that he is not the only one. The amount of loss and devastation in our community it's felt by thousands.
Yeah.
But for me personally, I was close enough to be touched by Barry in a really special way. While I was at the funeral, this degree of unrest came inside my body, and it didn't stop for a long time, because I had the same questions that everybody else had. How could have this happened with such a purposeful, popular, humble gentleman as Barry? And why didn't I see the signs, or why didn't somebody see the signs? But the thing that caused the most unrest is the idea that I'm sitting here grieving over this person, and how many more are out there? So it was kind of an agonizing couple of months after knowing about Barry's death, because there was just a few of us that really knew the nature of his death. And I wanted to give his family the respect. I wanted to give them permission to be the ones to disclose what happened. And it actually happened here in a Hope Gala last year, where Emily did disclose that Barry took his own life. I felt a sense of relief, where other people in the audience felt a sense of probably grief and shock.
Of course. But ultimately, it does then become something that you can talk about, and that you can say, you can say it doesn't always, excuse me, it doesn't always look the way you think it's going to look. Someone suffering, someone going through pain doesn't always look like things you'd expect. And then people that are professionals that are trained can help a community understand. And, so Yeah, that's, and actually I want to take a moment just because Barry obviously was known very, very well, but for people who might not know, can you just talk a little bit about his life and his work and why he was such an important leader?
Exactly so, because Barry's story is so similar to a lot of people. He didn't want to own many, in the very beginning, having hemophilia was excruciating in his cases. He lost his brother, he lost his brother-in-law, and for a long time, his way of coping was to hide and stay as far away from the hemophilia community as he can. And I want to give kudos to HFA and the program of Blood Brotherhood. That is actually it. He looked at that flyer for a long time, he told me, and finally he said, okay, I'm in. And he picked up the phone, and then he became a giant in our community of just identifying and being humble about it and helping others. So from that point, not only did he just go 110% for Blood Brotherhood, that's when he got involved with Save One Life. That's when he rode across the United States 5 times, over 20,000 miles, raising $250,000 for little kids that he'd probably never meet, but they were in his heart. And that's who Barry was.
Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. So you had learned the truth of your dear friend's passing, and you did have a background that was uniquely poised to take that in and think about that and think about what resources might be missing in this community to help someone else that might be going through something similar. And that was sort of a moment where your two paths converged.
Exactly, and that's where this little guy came into play.
Okay, tell us about him.
So mental health first aid is what this koala bear represents. His name is ALGIE, and ALGIE stands, it's an acronym for the 5 action steps you take to learn how to recognize that when someone's having a problem with mental health conditions. It could be depression, anxiety, bipolar, substance abuse. And then it teaches you how to have that conversation, how to have a compassionate conversation where you're there for that person. Either if they don't want to get help at that moment, that's fine. But the third part of mental health first aid is identifying the resources. And you alluded to the idea that I work with Mental Health America.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I did. That was my job, is to find mental health resources in the Houston area.
Yeah.
And so it is now my mission to go around, hopefully make something like CPR, make mental health first aid just as common as that.
Yeah.
And to create this culture with Patrick and with a lot of different people who are trying to do the same thing that I'm doing.
And so you started your organization.
And then I started a company called Mental Health Matters Too. And I usually like to start off by saying, you know, I did that because I found this amazing study in Harvard. They've discovered that our heads are attached to our body. I mean, it just sounds insane that given the chronic condition that we have and knowing that depression and anxiety is the common side effect, it's time to wake up, put my shoes on it, and get started.
That's wonderful. We will hear more about that, but I want to bring up our third panelist. So thank you so much, Debbie.
Thank you very much.
And please make welcome Jacose Bell.
Oh, I got it.
Hi, Jacose.
Hi.
So, Jacose, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining our panel.
Yeah.
Jacose, if you don't know, is from Portland, Oregon, and she is the vice president of Gut Monkey. And you've been there since 2014, right?
Yep.
Yes. Awesome. And similar to Debbie, I was struck by this. You sort of had, in some ways, 2 worlds converge that led you to Gut Monkey. Your experiences in the with outdoor education, the outdoor community, and your work in advocacy. So can you speak a little bit about those 2 worlds and your background?
Yeah. So I, as Heather said, I grew up in Oregon. And in Oregon, we're really fortunate to have a pretty unique public school funded program called Outdoor School. And when I was in 6th grade, like all 6th grade students, I got to go to camp for the first time in my life. I grew up on a farm, and I'm an only child, so my parents couldn't really afford to send me to camp for a lot of reasons. And so this was my first exposure to being in that kind of a program. And at outdoor school, you learn all about environmental sciences, but in a really immersed, experiential way. And so I had, a really amazing experience as a sixth grader that kind of launched me into volunteering for that program all through high school, and I ended up teaching for that program for a number of years while I was in my early 20s and going through college. So that really got me passionate about experiential education because I saw how impactful it had been for me, and I also saw how impactful it was for so many kids that I began working with who were really struggling in regular school for a lot of reasons, and who really thrived at outdoor school in a pretty amazing way. Additionally, I think outdoor school and working in experiential education also started to expose me to just all the things that kids bring to school with them that are going on at home and that are going on in their lives that we don't know about and we don't talk about very often. And as I started college, really wanting to focus on, I wasn't sure how, helping kind of talk more about some of that. I also noticed that when I was walking to college every day in Portland, there were a lot of people on the street. And homelessness, I had not really seen on that scale before. I grew up in a more rural part of Oregon, and then I'd been in the woods teaching kids for 5 years. So it really struck me, and it bothered me. And so one day I walked into a nonprofit in Portland called Street Roots, which is a street newspaper that is a platform for folks who are experiencing or have experienced homelessness to really have more of a voice in the conversation. And I asked if I could start volunteering, and that kind of began another 4-year education. I mean, I really think about my college experience as I got a degree in history and I got a degree in humanity at Street Roots. So it was a pretty amazing experience.
So why did Gut Monkey's mission, when Pat called you, why did Gut Monkey's mission resonate for you in terms of those two pathways that led you there?
Yeah, I think when Pat called me, getting to have the opportunity first to just sit down and talk to him more about this amazing community that I had been peripherally hearing about for years was exciting, just to get to dig into more of what he was doing. But the opportunity to bring experiential education, which I was so passionate about, into teaching people advocacy skill building and leadership skill development, and getting to work not just with teenagers, which I had continued to work with in various settings, but to get to bring that to adults had become really important to me and is still really a big part of what I love so much about what we get to do. I think we tend to think of adulthood as this place that we arrive into and we're like, ta-da, I did it. And I think all of us know that's not true, and we get to develop hopefully through our whole lives, and I think that deserves the same kind of support and experiential education that we give a lot of our young folks. So, a lot of that opportunity to work in adult education and adult advocacy really spoke to me.
And so for people who might not know what Gut Monkey does specifically, can you kind of give us the nutshell version of that?
Yeah, sure. For those of you that didn't see Pat do a pretty phenomenal job last night of telling you a little bit about what we do, Gut Monkey is an experiential education company. That means that we design and deliver programs that are really created to look at specific behaviors and how we might change those, think about those, play with those a little bit. So Pat talked a lot about our comfort zone being a place that we really like to start from. Right? We want to start by sitting with you in that place and then nudging you a bit to get into that growth zone. And we use all sorts of what we call modalities, which is a fancy word for games, activities, boats, the outdoors, art, music, right? We explore lots of ways in which we might do something together that creates an opportunity for us to talk about the skills that we brought to bear in that experience and how those skills transfer back into our everyday life and ideally our health care and taking better care of ourselves.
And that is a great segue to my next question, which is something that struck me on the phone is that you said you have two conversations with people. One is about their hemophilia specifically, or other bleeding disorders specifically, and the other is their overall health care, and how those two ideas are both, in some ways, separate and important to acknowledge separately, but of course interconnected. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think I hear from a lot of the folks that we get the opportunity to work with that, there is this focus on coordinated care in hemophilia, and that they go to an HTC potentially for a visit, and they get seen by, a physical therapist and a social worker and a doctor, and they check in with their nurse. But even with all of that touch point, it's a very narrow focus of how they're doing as a person, or they might only have 15 or 20 minutes to talk to somebody, and that's not a lot of time to have a real meaningful conversation about your hemophilia or von Willebrand's or whatever bleeding disorder you might be there for, connecting into who you are as a whole person. And I think in our culture, we tend to talk about healthcare in a very fragmented way, and we talk about it in a very physical way. Right? It's what you look like. Do you look healthy? And I think what we really want to do in our programs is open up that conversation into an acknowledgement that people, I like to say, I think that people are little ecosystems, right? All of these symbiotic little spaces ideally working together. And if one thing isn't working, then the whole system isn't really working or thriving at least. So how can we really think more holistically about what it means to be healthy?
Is there one experience that you've had on a gut monkey trip that stands out to you as sort of definitive in terms of seeing the impact, as someone who is new to the bleeding disorders community when you started working there? And I'm sort of putting you on the spot here,
okay.
But one experience that stands out to you as definitive of this community and the impact that the work you guys do can have?
Yeah, gosh, there's so many. I feel really lucky that we get to see a lot of pretty cool experience. We share a lot of really cool experiences with people. The one that comes to mind for me was on one of our Leading X trips. And our Leading X trips are a pretty cool experience in that you are on an expedition, which most people have never experienced before. You're in a boat, you're moving camp every day. It's big growth zone time for most of us. And they're also really intergenerational. So we have increasingly, which I think has been really special, we have folks, and on this particular trip, we had folks who were in their 20s all the way through a gentleman who was 70. I think he was actually 71. And he had never learned how to self-infuse because he was a moderate and felt like he didn't need to and was accessing medical services when he did need to infuse. But what it meant too was that he was letting himself bleed in these situations and kind of waiting to go in at times. And on the trip, he had the opportunity to hang out with these younger folks who were self-infusing and started to really think about, well, maybe I should learn. And in this really amazing peer-to-peer, intergenerational couple of days, these younger folks kind of coached him and helped him get to the place where he self-infused for the first time at 71 years old on that trip.
Wow.
Which was pretty powerful.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to take that as our button on the one-on-one conversation section, and now we are going to use the next 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, to be able to take questions and have a group conversation. So thank you all for sharing all of your stories. Where I'd like to start is, I think you all, after our conversations, I'm sort of struck by the fact that you all are sort of outside the box thinkers. I think you all sort of represent some new energy and some new ideas that are, coming into this community and breathing a new, sort of energy into aspects that haven't necessarily been acknowledged previously. And I think that it's almost innovative in its thinking and in its approach, each one of you. And so, Julian, I want to start with you because I think, to some, support groups have been around for a while, but I think, it sounds to me like hope groups are doing something different than what a traditional support group does. And so I wonder if you can speak to what makes hope groups different than more traditional support groups, and what makes hope different than other organizations in its execution.
I think the focus on patients and people and sharing your experience on a very kind of level playing field, it's not hierarchical. It's very egalitarian, where we have the same issues, and there is a freedom to kind of say the things that you wouldn't say during a PowerPoint presentation, but to just have community. And that's a really powerful part of self-acceptance, is being that way in front of other people as well.
Absolutely. Debbie, what do you think about how have we addressed mental illness or depression or challenges historically, and what new changes, what innovative thinking do we need to address moving into, a new era that you're a part of right now?
Yeah, the first thing I wanted to say is that to make sure it's not egocentric, I know that National Hemophilia Foundation has a whole network of social workers that are working on this on a daily basis, and HFA has theirs as well.
Yeah.
But it's exactly what you were talking about. When you think about it, there's 146 social workers, there's 7 psychologists to deal with the psychosocial needs of 20,000 people with hemophilia and their families, and 300,000 with von Willebrand's, not to mention other disorders. We are completely outnumbered, and it's programs like Hope Circle that they create that space that not only can we let someone know, I see you, I see that you're struggling with something, but we ourselves are the soldiers. We walk the journey, and we've developed internal resources or found external ways of getting our financial needs made, or different ways of coping. Yeah. So the way I like to look at it is, hopefully we're going to be more humanistic about it, like you talked about, and we're hopefully going to do things that are more, you talked about holistic thinking. Yeah. Just making sure that if my statement is, there's no health without mental health. And we've got to, I hope we become super sensitive to that and create this culture, it's okay not to be okay.
Yeah. And Jacose, unless you have anything to add, I'm actually going to give you my next question. And it sort of segues right off of that, because as you just pointed out, Debbie, as both of you there are a lot of resources. There is an incredible strength in this community, not just from individual to individual, but also in, the organizations that have, been created around this community, and there is a lot of engagement. And one of the things that you said on the phone to me, Jacose, that really stayed with me, as a person who is relatively new as well, is you said the sophistication of advocacy within this world is very unique, and there's a lot to be learned, for people that might be in other rare disease communities. There's a lot to be learned from what the bleeding disorders community is doing right. Even though there is a long way to go, we're doing a lot right. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, when I joined Gut Monkey 4.5 years ago, coming from other realms of advocacy work, I was incredibly struck by how connected this community is, how emotionally present and available this community is with each other, and what great advocates for the agenda of the entire community I feel like every single person was that I met. And I think, as I shared with Heather, I think some of that comes from a really heartbreaking and horrible side of the history of this community. That this community went through the HIV and Hep C crisis, I think was a devastation, also incredibly galvanizing. And there was a certain foundation that built that I see as something actually that provided quite a roadmap forward. And so as I work now with again, these intergenerational programs where there are young adults now that really don't have any living memory of that time, working with older adults who were very much on the front lines of the architecture of that advocacy movement. What I see is this really wonderful educating going on again in this peer-to-peer way. And we've talked a lot about in Gut Monkey programs how powerful that ability to speak to and teach other people about how community building and advocacy work really does change the landscape for rare disease communities, and what could we do for sickle cell? What could we do for enzyme disorders? What could we do for muscular dystrophy, right? Like, we've talked a lot about how this community might pay it forward in some ways that I think are really inspiring.
I'm curious to hear some of those ways, because my next question was going to be, how do we share what we've learned? And I was going to bring it back to what we were talking about earlier, Julian, how often care, doesn't just vary according to your diagnosis, but according to your socioeconomic level, your race, your gender. There are all of these variables that factor into how people are getting the care or not that they need, that they deserve. So, anyone, I would be very curious to hear if there are ideas of how can we share what we've learned with other communities, even within the bleeding disorders realm, but then outside as well. How can we share the lessons and the sophistication so that everybody, we can all rise?
One of the things I love that Jonathan James said, and my father said this all the time, because he was at the hospital with me as a kid, and he said, go to the ER, go to the children's ward or wherever you want to go, and you will see somebody in a worse state than you. And the idea is not, oh wow, thank God I'm not them. The idea is, oh my gosh, it could be worse, and then to use that emotion as a motivator to do more, and to take that empathy, sympathy, whatever you want to call it, and to use that as your fuel to go forward.
It's amazing that we talk to ourselves a lot in this community, and that is the humanness and the connection through adversity, but through just general caring for one another.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'd like to encourage everybody that can hear this, is that if we can help other people outside the community see that we're not a rare disorder, that is something that we're experiencing, but we're humans working with adversity. And in our case, it just happens to be a chronic condition. But if we can help other people understand that we're just like them, we have the same hopes and dreams, and the same life circumstances. And so we can get that conversation we can spend time telling them what we're doing about it to all kinds of family, friends, relatives, other disease states. That's our responsibility.
I do think that some of these big categories that Heather listed around our race and our gender and our socioeconomic status, right, the humanness of our experience, regardless of some of the specificities, are places where we can really, I think, build coalition, right, and build collaboration. I know that I'm certainly passionate about how healthcare impacts, or access to healthcare impacts, certain communities, and that certainly shows up in hemophilia. And I think we've been talking more and more about that around women and women's access to diagnoses and care. We've been talking more and more about how race affects the way that you're engaged with when you walk into an emergency room or you walk into your hospital. We've been talking more and more about ageism and some of these things that I think are hard to want to broach because they're not easy conversations. But I think that this community is so skilled at connecting on a human level around some of these issues. And I think there's really powerful opportunity to build coalitions across other communities that are experiencing similar issues because those inequities affect all of us.
In times of crisis, the inclination so often is to isolate or hide, right? I want to go through this, I just want to be in a dark room. I know I can speak for I just want to be in a dark room. I want to binge old Friends episodes or whatever it is. But that instinct of self-preservation and wanting to hide, those are the moments where we most need to engage, actually, for our well-being and to come through those times. So I wonder if any of you, and I think especially for people with bleeding disorders, You know, whether it's that you're struggling with it as part of your identity or you just don't want to stand out when you're young, we do sort of develop this muscle of hiding or being secretive about something that makes us different than our peers, especially as a young person. So when you've exercised that muscle so well growing up, and then you just have the natural human instinct of wanting to hide in times of crisis, what are some good tools or techniques, and I guess I'll start with you, Debbie, for people that might be going through hard times? How do you fight that instinct and do what you guys are all saying, which is engage, talk, reach out? What are some good tools for people?
Yeah, other than the idea of what we're doing on a systematic level, where we're creating a normalcy about talking about our depression, our anxieties, and our worries, just like we're talking about the degree or the lack of degree of range of motion in our joints. We're doing really good with that. But it can't stop there. What I was really struck with yesterday is how when I was doing mental health first aid with this amazing group of Hope leaders, is a gentleman were letting me know that this is going to be a tough road for us in general, because the mindset of a young man and an older man with hemophilia, hiding is how they coped. That's their go-to. And it's not just that, it's because they didn't want to be seen as vulnerable or weak, and it's super, super important for them. And so that's something we need to penetrate. But just keeping this, it's okay to be not okay, and continue the conversation, and calling each other out too. I love what Patrick was talking about yesterday about pulling the hemo card, right? You know, that's what we do to confront somebody that, you know what, you're utilizing right now, you're hiding behind. And so if we just make it normal to talk about depression, we can say things like, I get it, you're about to go hide. Let's figure this out. What would happen if you didn't go hide right now? And you did go to a support group, or you did do an article.
Yeah.
Just keeping that going.
I think one of the things that we talk a lot about in our programs, you know, we talk a lot about the importance of building community so that you do have people you feel like you can reach out to. But one of the things, as I've been listening this morning to my co-panelists and also just taking in this conference, is that I think this is an important opportunity for any of us to lead in. And so what I mean by that is I think anytime we have an opportunity to model how it could be different in the world, right? To model that we could share something. We could step outside of our comfort zone in a community space and be willing to share something that's personal and a little vulnerable. Because every time we do that, it gives somebody else in that circle a little bit of permission or a view into a way of being in community that's very different. You know, I think a lot of what I've really connected to around Brené Brown's work, you know, Jonathan shared Brené Brown last night, you know, she talks a lot about shame, and that a lot of what drives us to hide is that we're ashamed of what we're experiencing and the emotions we're feeling, because we're somehow still, we think we're alone in that, you know. And I love seeing all these t-shirts walking around in this space, you are not alone. None of us are. I mean, we're always in the existential crisis, right, if we're alone and we're not alone. But I think what's really possible in leading from that servant place is just being the person in the circle that will take the risk to be vulnerable in public. And what that possibly opens up for someone else is really powerful.
I was thinking, you know, practice makes perfect. You know, we were talking yesterday about, you know, the road to success is not this straight path. You know, there's all these little side avenues that you take. And to have that community, I mean, I was just thinking at the top of my head, you know, if you're a woman with a bleeding disorder, it takes not only multiple times, but maybe years to finally get a diagnosis, because you're always having to try to convince somebody. As a hemophiliac, you know, we're the kind of wounded gazelle, you know, like we're trying to pretend and limp along with the herd like we're not hurt. But you have to have that ability to come into the community, recharge your batteries, to go back out and fight that battle on your own. And so being able to have that space where you can kind of practice, and then when you're out there on your own, you can be perfect.
leading by example. Well, all of you really said this, leading by example, and it connects to, what Jonathan was saying yesterday as well, and particularly in terms of being vulnerable and allowing yourself to be vulnerable and letting others see that and take inspiration from that. I love the language within the Hope for Hemophilia mission about seasons of crisis. And I connect to that so much, very much, because, even if it's just a moment, it can feel like a lifetime. But I love that idea of seasons because it gives the promise of the season changing. But often it takes an individual or a leader or a friend or a community member to help get you through that season of crisis. So I didn't give you guys a heads up about this question, so if you need a moment to think, that's fine. But I wonder if you would be willing to share with our audience. You don't have to go into too much detail about what the season of crisis was, but if there was an individual who helped lead you out of that season, who turned the light on in that room, who opened that door, who said you're not eating, who identified your warning signs and then helped you through, would each of you be willing to share a piece about who that person was and what they did? And you can share your crisis as well if you want, but you don't have to.
Sure, I don't mind going since that's kind of what I do. But, 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with a major depressive disorder with complicated grief. I'm like, oh my gosh, that sounds really bad. But what it was is that I thought I had resolved a lot of things in my life and something triggered me. And I went right back even deeper than I had ever gone before. And for me, it was my husband who, when I would go into these depressive spirals and it seemed hopeless and it wouldn't release me, it wasn't me, it was something going on inside my brain because depression is biochemically based. The words that he said to me were, oh, guess what? You're in a depressive wave again, and you're gonna get better in about 24, 36 hours. And I go, oh, perfect. I mean, that's what helped me. Somebody said, I see you, you're in pain, and you're gonna be okay. That's what I needed.
I think it doesn't take a hero. I think in some ways we're our own worst enemy. Internally you'll say things so mean to yourself that you would never say to a stranger on the street. You would just be like, that's terrible, but you'll say it to yourself in the mirror. And when someone just says something nice, when you're in that kind of downward spiral, that's really what lifts you up, and it doesn't take very much,
My partner as well. My partner and I have been together for 6 years. And that's crazy. And time goes. But, when we met, I was struggling quite a bit. My partner, was really the first person who saw me and said, I see you, and you're not fooling me, and you're worth a lot more than you think you are, which made a big difference for me.
Thank you guys so much. Please, let's give thanks to our panelists, Jacose Bell, Debbie De La Riva, Julian Borjas. Want to thank Hope for Hemophilia again for hosting our Powering Through panel. And thank you guys so much for being here this morning. I hope you have a wonderful day. And thanks again to our panelists, Hope for Hemophilia, NCHS. We'll see you later.
To watch video from any of our previous Powering Through sessions, visit poweringthrough.org, or to learn more about National Cornerstone Healthcare Services, NCHS, visit nchswecare.com.